These words are getting, thrown around quite a lot. People in organizations are saying that they have a commitment to this. However, if we scratch a little bit beyond the surface, especially when we're thinking about your leadership teams, are they able to talk about it, right? The people who are leading these volunteer programs, do they have the language? Do they have the awareness, right? Also, does your organization actually equip you all with the language and the ways in which the organization has defined these terms and grappled with these frameworks? So that's the reason that it's really important, because more and more people are asking. Your market share is asking, right? The people who, your clients, also potential funders, also partners are saying, hey, what's your approach? Can you actually talk about it besides the statement that's potentially placed on a website? So of course, there are different types of biases here, right? So explicit and conscious bias, unconscious or implicit bias. There's also cultural conditioning that influences all of this. Also confirmation bias, affiliation, stereotype, performance. And most importantly, all of that leads to the individual biases informing institutional bias. And so I love Femi's quote, if you have a brain, you have a bias. We're human, like it's what it is. And of course we can educate ourselves and train ourselves, but it doesn't mean that our cultural conditioning has been as such that we still maybe have knee-jerk reactions to things and responses. So we've gone over the different types of confirmation biases. So conscious and explicit, we kind of know that one, right? So it's the reflexive. It requires conscious motivation. It's deliberate, and people know when they're being biased. You know it, right? So people who know that they're using harmful or hateful speech, racism, sexism. So there has to be conscious knowledge and intent there for the person maybe creating the harm. Unconscious or implicit. Think about it as like going to the doctor and they test your knees to see how your reflexive system is. And so they tap you with a rubber hammer and all of a sudden your leg should shoot up. And so without you thinking about it. So it's your quick, immediate response. And so often that's with little to no thinking. And this is the stuff that's most prevalent, right? And it's attitudes and stereotypes and ideas that we're exposed to through our social conditioning that affect our understanding and actions and our decisions in an unconscious manner. And then confirmation bias, right? It's our individual echo chambers, right? We have a tendency to search and interpret information in a way that aligns with our own preconceptions and our own belief or value systems at the expense of ignoring any information to the contrary, meaning any information that might counter one's biases or one's belief system. Affiliation, and this is very prevalent within companies and organizations in terms of hiring and recruiting. It's like, oh, I know a person who knows a person, or oh, this person went to my school, so I feel more comfortable with them, or this person looks like me, or we have a similar life experience, so I am more comfortable with them. And that pervades our recruitment strategies, which have some potentially unintentional harms down the road in terms of the composition of your teams, but then also the culture that you build by operating in that manner. Stereotype bias, kind of know this, right? So it's basically preconceived notions that are attributed to certain groups, right? And often they're oversimplified, they're exaggerated, and also demeaning in their assumptions there. Performance, right? So there's sometimes incorrect assumptions about the disparity between one's ability and the groups with which they identify, or with which they're perceived to identify. And so sometimes, and we can think about it in terms of our pronouns, right? Someone might look at another person and believe or perceive that they are of one gender, but they self-identify as a different gender, and what comes along with that kind of preconceived notions. So this is the good stuff, especially for companies and organizations here. So institutions, companies, nonprofits, any kind of collection of people, right, are made up of individuals. And those individuals come to a space, come to an organization with their own core values, their own mindsets and individual behaviors. And that's what's called deep culture. And then they get into a space together, right? And the surface culture is the kind of verbal and written and nonverbal interactions and communications. So it's the way that people engage. It's maybe the dress code of a certain place or certain silent cues that people give to each other within a group or within a company, that signals that they're engaging with each other in a specific way, a kind of code, you can say. And then all of that, again, individuals make up institutions. So there are people deciding what the cultural norms are. There are people deciding what the policies and practices are. And there are people deciding what patterns of organizational behavior are. And one way to think about this is both New York State and California in the past year have enacted something called the Crown Act. And they basically, this legislation basically says that companies cannot say that someone's hair, whether it's in a natural, natural form, has to be that has to be neat and tidy, right? And say, oh, that means that, let's say, locks aren't neat and tidy. Oh, let's say if you're Sikh and if you're a man, you have to have a clean shaven face. Well, that goes against, someone's religion, but also some people's, inherent characteristics that are associated with their racial groups, right? And so you can't put that in your handbook in California and New York. And thinking about that, what's a clean presentation look like? And so to say that you can't have facial hair or that your hair has to be in one pattern and not another has some implications, right? There's a bias there. There's a standard there that's unspoken in terms of what's expected or what's appropriate and what's not. And so again, these institutional bias here is that tendency for the procedures and the practices to operate in ways that result in social groups being advantaged or favored and others being disadvantaged, using again that Crown Act comparison for you all. Intersectionality. This is one that's getting a lot of play. It's been around since the late 80s by the fabulous legal scholar, Professor Kimberly Crenshaw. And so if you look to the right side of the screen, I like images, right? So every one of us has all different types of identities that people either see or don't see. Some things are more private or you can't see it just by looking at us, right? That includes our family status, our education, race, age, occupation, sexuality, gender, heritage, so on and so forth. And so how all of those identities intersect with each other at certain points along the line, right? In terms of in spaces that we're in or, issues that we're confronted with, that might mean that people are treating us in a different way or that we also are showing up in a different way. And that has some important impacts in terms of outcomes, whether or not they're disparate for one group versus others. So really, it's the acknowledgement that within groups of people within a common identity, whether it be gender or sexuality or any of those other things, there exist intragroup differences. And so you can't have sweeping generalizations, and individuals in a group also belong to other social groups and may experience other forms of marginalization. Another quick example here is, I use this sometimes where you can take two young Black women, let's say Sasha Obama, we know the Obamas, right? And let's take a young Black woman who might have been involved in the criminal justice system for reasons that we don't know. The world is going to treat them differently, right? They also have different trajectories. They also have different networks. So because there are two Black women on the outside, you're not aware of some other things that are intersecting that impact the way that the world treats them and the way that they are, the impacts in terms of their trajectory. So intersectionality is hugely important. And I'll let Professor Crenshaw speak for herself. Socially marginalized groups, people all over the world were facing all kinds of dilemmas and challenges as a consequence of intersectionality. Intersections of race and gender, of heterosexism, transphobia, xenophobia, ableism, all of these social dynamics come together and create challenges that are sometimes quite unique, and again, have impacts on people. All right, so now that we have gone through some level setting and hopefully equipped you with some language and some frameworks. Now let's get down to the volunteer programs that you all are either launching or seeking to revamp or improve by infusing DEAI within your programs. So your posture, the first thing is asking yourselves and asking your companies, okay, if in addition to a statement that we might have on race equity or DEIA, do we actually define these terms for us, for ourselves? Because every organization has, a different target audience and also serves different communities. More specifically, you all have different unique issues facing your industry, and your company has unique ideas in terms of its solve and its commitment to addressing DEAI issues. So, you can't just necessarily take Merriam-Webster's definitions. People want to see that you all are critically thinking about these things. And so let's say Chanel, the fashion industry has very different issues. Some of them, overlapping with, let's say, Citigroup and Guggenheim, financial institutions, right? There's a history of who's been allowed in and not allowed into these industries, the way that, their target audiences, the products, the communities that they're serving. So thinking about all of that in shaping your posture and also thinking about how you're defining these words for yourselves. Step 2, so you've got the words, but how do people live those words, right? So you've got to detail the behavior that align with your definitions and your values, right? And so you can create codes of conduct and also volunteer packs so that the people that you're recruiting, your employees that you're recruiting for the volunteer pack, but also more importantly, the employees that you're recruiting overall understand how to live the company's values. And most importantly, it sets a clear expectation of how you expect your volunteers to engage in the work and behave in line with your values, right? Because they are actually going to be the people that are your ambassadors to the organizations that you're working with and the communities that you're working with in terms of volunteer efforts. And a note here is that the posture and the language that you establish for your volunteer program should align with what's been articulated across your company, right? So you can't necessarily have two ways of being because you don't want to confuse your staff. So recruitment, onboarding, and retention. So how can you recruit staff for volunteer opportunities? Many people on this call mentioned the affinity groups and employee resource groups. And really it's about going and talking to them and saying, hey, do you all have different types of groups or causes that you're interested in, maybe creating a collaborative approach? So sometimes companies know the causes, know the volunteer programs, know the organizations that they want to work with. However, it would be wonderful to ask your affinity groups or your employee resource groups which values or which causes they're interested in, because you want to make sure that what you're asking them to volunteer for, they're actually excited about doing. Right? We all know that if you're not excited about something, that's that little X factor that makes your work great versus excellent. Also, offering volunteer opportunities to staff from across the organization. Someone mentioned in their introduction that many times there are certain types of staff and team members that are asked to volunteer and certain ones that aren't. And so are you actually looking at your staff, let's say from facilities and also security and operations, those that may not be brought into the fold in terms of your culture, to ask them, say, hey, are you interested in these opportunities? But then also equipping them with what they need, right? And so that also serves to strengthen your inclusion efforts across your organization by including these sometimes invisible team members across your organization. And you also need to have a baseline. I'm really big on baseline. Where are we starting from? So you've got to create a standard for creating your diverse volunteer bench. You can use a variety of metrics for this. Sometimes it's based on your internal staff demographics, right? You can't have different demographics for your volunteer program that are totally out of alignment with what your overall team looks like. So, starting there to look at your internal staff demographics is a way to plot that path. And then again, to the point of one of the people on the call here, considering ways to unprivilege volunteering, right? So we got to think about within your larger team, who can afford to volunteer in terms of time and flexibility. Oftentimes, this is hourly staff versus salaried staff. So you want to create volunteer opportunities inside and outside also of the traditional workday. And COVID has made all of that very tricky, right? What is the traditional workday when people are having to take care of family matters and school children at the same time while they're trying to work? I know someone just joined the call and they're saying, oh, I had to make sure my daughter was set up to begin her school day. And then also thinking about, removing barriers. So this accessibility piece, right? So offering childcare for volunteers with children. Asking yourself, what other barriers can my company remove so that people that we want to reach out to and might have the diversity that we want on our volunteer bench, what barriers do we need to remove for them? And then you need to use the DEIA framework and posture of your company to inform your selection criteria, right? And so you want to vet people. So you want to include questions related to cultural competency in application documents or processes. So if you've got like a Google form, hey, we've got this great opportunity to volunteer with this awesome organization. You want to ask about, someone's cultural competence. You want to ask like what their experiences are dealing with different types of populations, right? Like, and also asking what they need to be successful, right? And not assuming that everyone knows how to volunteer, everyone knows how to engage outside of your organization, while also maintaining the ethics and what you expect for your team members to have as they engage with larger communities. Onboarding, right? And this is where you establish those expectations. So think about your orientation process. Always, again, remind people of your company's mission and your vision and your values. Also, really drill down and say, hey, here are DEAI values as well. You want to also manage expectations, right? So that people understand what the types of behaviors and what should be, and also what their engagement's going to look like. So thinking about really drafting a clear and also concise. We don't want to make it over, too long so that people stop reading and just glaze over, right? So thinking about a volunteer pact as a way to adhere to a model of your DEI values. And then training, making sure that, you can't necessarily solve for the types of things people may have learned, whether it be through like their life experiences or the things that they do outside of your organization, or if you have different types of trainings that are offered within your companies, you want to always make sure that you're creating a baseline for all people. So have some, refresher trainings, make sure that there's comprehensive training and everyone understands the different types of protocols for their volunteer programs, and also make sure that they know who their staff contacts are, right? So who are their systems of support if things go left, right, within during their volunteering process. Retention. So there are some key issues here that we've got to think about. You've got to define what recognition looks like. What does a thank you look like? Because we're thinking about how do we invite different types of team members in. Again, also taking care to think about what pools and what departments have you not traditionally drawn from, right? And so they're providing their time and their talent and also their resources in terms of their knowledge to the organization through their human capital, right? So they're giving more to you all. And so thinking about how can you recognize and show appreciation for your volunteers. And then ensure that you've provided a safe and welcoming environment from volunteers, specifically maybe from departments that aren't traditionally included in such programs, right? And so we can think about, if there are barriers, has facilities and other aspects of culture building not been included in all staff trainings and all staff, outings or culture building, right? So you want to make sure that you're creating an inclusive environment for all of your team members. And again, that code of conduct is really important. And also just to make sure that people feel protected, thinking about detailing the forms of harassment, including racism, and also making sure that you've established clear reporting protocols for your volunteers, right? And also maybe anonymous options, just so that people can feel comfortable that they might not be unnecessarily targeted, whether that is truth or not. People sometimes feel apprehension about being identified in the first instance. So you want to give them as many options as possible. Learn about your volunteers. So even in the point of recruiting, right? Identify what their skills are, like identify what their time availability and their interests are, because you want them to be excited, right? And so you want to closely match what their interests and availability and skills are with the opportunities that you have in terms of your volunteer program. And you also want to know what motivates them, right? Again, you want to learn about them so that you're not having some mismatches. It doesn't work for your volunteer and it doesn't work for the organization that you're giving your time to. Also include ongoing support, including training and mentoring. Think about this volunteerism within your companies as another professional development opportunity, right? And so professional development means that, you know, you're having consistent training and also there's some mentorship across the way. And then thinking about like, what are the perks, right? So like, what do I get out of this? Again, I'm giving you my human capital. This might not be, you know, this is volunteer, it's not mandatory. So, you know, you got to zhuzh it up a little bit, right? So think about having free access to different types of programming that maybe you offer for clients or, you know, offer for your customers. Maybe, you know, think about offering that to your volunteers. Food always works. People love food. We all know that, especially when we're allowed in the office a lot. Like, you leave food around, it's gone real quick. And just think about what other types of perks you can use to say thank you to your team members that are giving their time, talent, and their human capital to your effort. And so I'm going to wrap this up with some key takeaways before we open it up for you all to discuss and maybe have some questions. So think about it. They're an important group that, you know, that are within your human capital pool, your volunteers, right? And so they're really important. So that value component there. Also, ensure that your company's established the necessary preconditions to support diverse staff corp, right? So defining your posture and your values and also being clear in terms of what that means in terms of behaviors. Develop relationships with your volunteers, right? And find ways to reward and recognize their work and contribution. And also be mindful of tokenization of diverse volunteers, right? And so, you know, maybe your organization, your company is not as diverse, and it's like, oh, we want 3 people from that demographic, or maybe we can get 1 person from that demographic. Don't ask them to speak on behalf of a group from which they belong, right? Don't ask them to do things that you wouldn't ask other volunteers to do simply because they are of a certain identity, right? So don't tokenize your volunteers either. And then that's it. So I will stop sharing my screen and open up for a few minutes for questions and also conversations amongst yourselves in terms of the work that you all have been doing. Someone here says, are we using ERGs and affinity groups? I'm looking at the chat interchangeably. So every company, some do, some don't, right? So employee resource groups and affinity groups. So an employee resource group generally is a group that it could be either started by an organization itself, or it might be staff started. Sometimes they are funded, right, or provided other means of support by your company. Affinity groups sometimes are the same thing, right? So it's like people who identify across a certain level, a different type of experience or identity, then come together to create a group to maybe address the concerns specifically related to their group, right? So thinking about, let's say, women's groups that a lot of companies have, right? Or LGBTQI groups that a lot of companies have. What's the difference between inclusion and integration? You know, it's interesting. So you want to make sure that people have meaningful opportunity to engage, right? And to integration is like making sure that people are mixing with each other, but it doesn't necessarily address the power component, right? That inclusion might, like, are people empowered to maybe raise their concerns or offer an opinion that's contrary, right? Or also giving opportunities to advance. Integration is, all right, maybe I have a diverse team and they work together. So they are integrated, but it might not necessarily be inclusive. And then I think that the tips from the group, so I'll maybe leave that for you all to respond to. Any recommendations for companies that provide DEAI training modules? So we, like, New York City Service is a client of Evolve's, right? And so they've outsourced this training to us. We do these types of different types of training opportunities, but also depending on what this think Leah. Excuse me, I'm sorry, Evan asked.
I was asking more for, like, in case I wanted to institute it for new employees when they're getting onboarded, like kind of more of a stagnant kind of training that we could reuse versus live.
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, they're modules, they're different, and especially within COVID, right? Our Hollywood Squares, a lot of stuff has been online. And then Anita, any best practices on how we can be operating with a strong DEI lens in terms of the nonprofit partners we work with for volunteer opportunities? So we actually gave a volunteer nonprofit training in December. So Shilpa, is there video?
Yeah, I can post the link to that for folks if they're interested from the nonprofit training.
And yeah. Go ahead.
No, it was just Amita. No, that would be great. I think that would be interesting perspective. But I guess I was also just thinking of, the occasional, like, power dynamic between sort of the funder and the nonprofit, and we're sending volunteers, to an organization. Are there certain sort of, lenses we should be keeping in mind in terms of those dynamics and ways that we can make sure that we're being kind of a fair, partner, in sort of DEI?
Yeah, absolutely. So, thinking about, like, harms, right? Unintentional harms and intent versus impacts. There's already a power dynamic sometimes, right? Between the funder providing volunteers to the organization that they fund, right? And so being mindful that those dynamics do exist and setting up, like, rules for the road, right? What's the engagement look like, right? How are you making sure that this is an equitable exchange, right? But then also not putting your nonprofit partners in a position that they feel like they're beholden to you if they don't do a thing, right? So you want to not necessarily tie everything to money, or you want to give them as much agency as possible. And that also for volunteer programs might mean including them in the vetting process, right? So you might have a set of volunteers, and then maybe you send their applications, right, to the service organization and say, hey, now from this, can we come up with the appropriate mix of people for you that your organization feels comfortable with, right? So it's also about letting them in on the process and creating as much as a co-equal relationship as possible. And so Stephanie, possible to share. So so I know that Shilpa and her team have these slides and they can be circulated.
Yeah, so we'll be circulating the slides, and then also hopefully shortly a video recording of some of this. I accidentally hit the record button a little bit later than I hoped from everything. So, but most of it's on there. So we'll be able to share that with you after the meeting, as well as some of the links to the nonprofit video as well.
Awesome, thank you. Also just wanted to say, you're a little modest. I really just wanted to reiterate that this is a really great presentation, really interesting information. You didn't read the rest of my comment, but figured I'd share. Great food for thought, some really great recommendations, and really one of the best presentations on this topic that I've seen. And I've been involved in a lot of them. So really appreciate your time and sharing.
Thank you, and I'm always happy to connect with any of you, my team and myself, and so we can share. Actually, I can just put it in if you wanted to, have separate conversations. Just please go to. I can't type and talk at the same time. I'm not that good yet, and I just put it in the chat for everyone if you want to reach out separately as well. But thank you so much for that compliment, Stephanie.
Thank you. Thank you.
So yes, what are some lessons learned from you all? So going back to Leah's question, any tips from the group for developing a meaningful rewards or recognitions program for volunteers? What have you all been doing? Share your best practices and maybe some of the things that you've had to retweak along the way.
Yeah, and I think also with that potentially challenges that you face
Yeah.
with some of this, I think this group has always been a great place to brainstorm and hear how others approach some of that stuff. So yeah, both of those I think would be very interesting to hear from.
Definitely.
I can share, although I don't know how helpful it will be, more of a challenge. So we just have a like an end of the year. So we work through a school year cycle. So at the end of the school year, we have a party through a donated space through one of our business partners, and we publicly acknowledge a couple of volunteers. But I mean, there are so many challenges with that. I mean, I love that, it's great there, but there are so many challenges with that. And we also have our volunteer pool, like while they are excellent, we have difficulty getting a really diverse group of people. So yeah, so that's really hard. But I really do like the idea of like publicly acknowledging certain volunteers, like within the entire group of volunteers that we have. I think that's like really motivating, and it's just like such a joyous, fun occasion.
Yeah, so,
Oh, go ahead.
sorry, no, you can go.
Oh, thanks. I think that our challenge at City is scale. We have about 200,000 colleagues around the world. And so a lot of what you were speaking about, Ebony, really resonated. Easier to do at the local level, harder to do when you have to kind of, I guess, trickle down and penetrate that messaging to about 500 to 600 other event leaders around the world who are trying to do that in their market, and kind of create that same personal touch in that area. And so a lot of what we do, we pilot in New York City, in the US, to see if it actually works. We worked with our HR team. We have a Live Well at Cities reward where we actually connected volunteerism to mental health, health improvement. And so when you participated in our Global Day of Service, you got a reward through our Live Well services in the US. Not something we can actually do internationally yet, but just something that we are, proud that we were able to push out to our US colleagues, especially to our non-exempt employees who, may not make as much. And so this is meaningful, and, we offer days off and things like that. So it's very challenging though to do all of those things at scale and through the lens of making sure that everyone is included, is at the table and has a voice, because there's so many voices. It's kind of challenging to kind of let everyone be heard.
That's a really, really important insight, Diane. Thank you. And so one of the things that, we think about with clients is how do you become hyper local, right? So there's the general standard that the organization, across all cities and also across the globe can have. But DEIA means very different things in Latin America, right? Than MENA, right? Middle East and North Africa than it is in, Asia Pacific, right? Like those words mean very different things. So also being, thinking about having the general broader approach, but then asking your teams on the ground, all right, what does it look like? What do we need to change, right? Like what makes people, how does this resonate in this specific market or within this specific office, right? And also the different needs and challenges are not the same, right? Across offices, even in the United States, right? Maybe what, Austin needs is different from what New York needs, is different from what Chicago needs. Again, different types of communities being served, different dynamics, different stakeholders and partnerships. So encouraging you all to really think about the different levels, right, of engagement and articulation of your vision, but then not thinking about having them operate on the same track, but parallel tracks, right? So we're all going towards the same kind of vision, but we've got to modify based on hyper local dynamics there, which is easier said than done. Like, absolutely easier said than done, I know.
On a much smaller scale, that really hits home for us. We're working right now on scaling our volunteer program out to our retail population. And so setting up an ambassador network where in each region we have 2 to 4, depending on how many employees are in the different cities, who are responsible for coordinating and recognizing like the local issues in their communities. So I can't be everywhere and I'm the only program manager, but setting up this like big network of ambassadors is, we're hoping, going to help.
Yeah. And maybe another kind of tool or channel to try. You all have different stakeholders and different partners, but thinking about, I think it was, your last name is Aguilar. Elizabeth. You were saying that your company is still having a little bit of difficulty in terms of diversification of the volunteer program. So maybe thinking about, all right, who are some of our partners, right? Like, we're partnering with other companies and organizations and some things. Maybe we can create a cross, like a cross company cohort of volunteers, right? That then we say, all right, who are the kinds of organizations that you partner with? Oh, wait, we totally would love to do something along those lines. Can we create an integrated cohort?
That's an awesome idea. Okay, can I ask a quick question here?
Please, this is what the time is for.
Okay, maybe slightly off topic, but how can we Claire and I don't actively recruit volunteers. So our development team recruits volunteers. Like, how can we say we need more Black people, we need more African or women, we need more Hispanic. How do we say that?
You say it, right?
You say that?
Look,
okay.
you say it, right? So you can say, look, we are actually trying, and you're a nonprofit. I see. Thank you, Claire, for that clarification, right? You say, look, here are our values. We are also trying to present, a cohort of volunteers that are reflective of our communities and reflective of New York City, right? And so that means different people with different types of identities, right? Racial, socioeconomic, gender, all of those things, right? So saying we want to be reflective of, and finish the sentence, right? Reflective of New York City, reflective of, the organizations of the communities that are being served, reflective of, right? Because again, going back to what is your baseline, right? Because you also don't want to create a volunteer cohort that unintentionally is incongruent, right, with the organizations that you're seeking to work with and to create relationships and to help them move whatever their ball is forward.
Can you come to our office when it reopens?
Shoot an email.
Yes, I was going to ask the same, so that's good. Maybe now I'll get on that wait list.
Other questions? Oh, someone was going to say something.
Yeah, so some other practices we do, if anybody wants to use this, we usually create monthly newsletters, and we highlight our volunteers and shout them out, telling everybody that reads our, who has done the most volunteer hours, or, just volunteering in general in our organization. And then also we also announce how many hours people do during our all staff meetings. So usually just shouting them out and be like, hey, Props did 160 volunteer hours, or Affinity did 12 hours, but it's still something where you can still have them feel comfortable enough to be like, all right, I can get out my shell and actually volunteer more because my coworkers are doing it.
Yeah, and thanks for that, Kwame. And I would just add the club NYCFC set a goal of completing 2,000 hours of service in 2020. Even when the pandemic happened, we still had that goal. So we were on the line for that, but we were actually able to triple that number by the end of the year. But the way that we were able to get a lot of hours towards the end of the year, we saw that we weren't doing that well, and worked with HR and leadership to actually get this spot on the all staff meetings every 2 weeks, where we would talk about volunteer initiatives coming up, and as Kwame said, volunteer hours completed. And I think that really helped us close the year out strong, and just got people excited about it. But they're also seeing the numbers, and we set up some competitions between departments as well, like which department is going to volunteer the most. But we also open up the volunteer activities to everyone on staff. So I think that helped us kind of hit that goal as well.
Cool, thanks, Props. And I'll say two things about your and Kwame's comments. So one of those things in terms of like the newsletter, excellent idea. One thing to think about in terms of inclusion is maybe there's certain staff that don't have necessary access or readily access to digital, right? Or like maybe, so thinking about ways to maybe make that paper format or other ways to communicate that, whether let's say for people who are hourly or like on a specific hourly schedule, like maybe at roll call or however that translate, right? To making sure that, again, everyone's excited, everybody knows, everyone's getting the information, because that also helps them feel included in terms of your organization, your company, right? It's like, oh yeah, they're asking us, they're giving us this information, right? But then that also that builds a seed in terms of maybe getting them excited about later on down the line, like raising their hand to participate, right? And then in terms of Props, what you were saying, I think it's really interesting to think about like how you communicate things, right? And your goals, right? Like, so it's great to say, hey, we've got these hours of goals, and then tying that to your mission and your vision, right? So like volunteerism is important. Why? In the context of your organization, why is it important, right? Why is that a value for you all, right? So just also tying it back to the mission, the values of the company.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Other questions, other, lessons or victories you'd like to share with the cohort here?
I have a question. It's a little bit off topic from what we've been talking about so far, but definitely curious to hear your thoughts on, as folks are volunteering in different communities, how much of this DEIA training do you feel like should come from the company in terms of preparing volunteers for those experiences, and how much should we rely on community partners to be giving that knowledge to our volunteers and prepping them for it?
Every community is different, right? And so you want to make sure that your partnership, you have a strong relationship, so that yes, your company has its overall vision, right? Its overall process, but it needs to be nimble and flexible enough to like conform or like to align with what your volunteer partner organization is doing, right? So different communities need different things, right? So again, thinking about this hyper local context, right? So, you just want to make sure that what, the team, the volunteer team that you're providing, and also their expectations and the skills needed match the communities, right? And also if there are things that, people need to have extra training on, right? Like, or be aware of certain things, right? That are specific to those types of communities that they know. So have your approach, have your standard, have what your baseline is, but then make sure that you're going to your partner, your volunteer organization partners, and saying, hey, here's what we're doing. What do we need to do, and what kind of modifications or updates do we need to make sure that are included here, so that we're providing you all with like the best volunteers, right? And the best kind of work that we want to give.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think really approaching that conversation with your partners and including them in on it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Let's see, maybe one or two more questions here, or lessons learned.
Hey, this is Divyam. Sorry, I keep double muting myself. I have a question. So, we're a broker-dealer investment bank, and, there's obviously this focus on, having a more diverse workplace. And not only that, but also developing talent. And that's one of the things that I think we're lacking, is that we're making the right decisions and thinking about the right things while recruiting, but not taking that next level and, really fostering, diverse talent.
Mhm.
So I guess my question is that, that was one of the issues that came up during one of the conversations I had with senior management. And, one of the things that they're unclear about is, what can they do to help? Like, what investments do they need to make? Is it just as simple as mentoring programs? Because, we do have mentor programs, but it's not really, it's not helping. And I don't know how much of it is the company's fault, or maybe it is the line manager's fault. And maybe fault is not the right word, but maybe responsibility to make sure that this happens. So I guess the question is, what kind of actually monetary investments we can make, and what kind of like social investments can we make to make sure that not only are we recruiting properly, but also fostering that talent. So, we have a diverse group of people. One of the issues with financial services companies are that there is a lack of diverse talent out there. At least that's what HR tells me. But there is, but it's not just as much, because people don't really want to go into financial services.
Mhm.
So how do we? And I know that's a lot of questions in one. Maybe you can say, maybe you could just put me on the right path here on, like, what should we invest? What should we be thinking about, and what should we be investing in?
Yeah, that's a whole training amongst it within itself. So I'll answer that, and I know that Diana,
Yes.
you unmute, and so maybe we'll pass to Diana for the last question after that. All right, so there, I think we have to kind of like dissect our assumptions, right? Is there a lack of interest in going to your industry, financial services, any industry, or are you looking in the wrong places, right? Are there relationships that you have not established, right, with different universities, different communities, right? Sometimes in terms of a financial investment, it is saying, hey, here's what our pipeline looks like. We need to maybe, hire different recruitment firms that specialize specifically in the types of hires that types of people that we are looking for, right? What kind of investments, what kind of paid internship possibilities, right, can we give to the communities and to the people that we're trying to have in our pipeline, right? Retention. Is it a matter of we're offering mentorship and stuff like that, or is there a culture issue, right? So you can say, yes, we offer services, but it goes back to that inclusion question and what your culture is like. So a first step that you can do is surveying people. Ask them, right? Why is this not sticking? Is it a matter of you don't know about it? Is it a matter of you don't feel empowered, or you don't think it's for you? Why is it not sticking, right? What are we missing? So I think ask your team, right? For suggestions, right? And again, have anonymous ways of doing it, have multiple ways of communicating and having that engagement, right? So that people feel that they can honestly respond to that question, right? And then there's different types of professional development, right? So you've got to think about what your professional development opportunities are. Is there money associated? You want to think about, okay, could you establish more ERG or affinity groups? How are we going to financially support those groups, right? So there's a variety of different ways to kind of approach and then identify and problem solve for the issues that you're facing. And I don't like cookie cutter stuff, because every organization is different, but those are some, so first steps that you can be thinking about. Diana.
Me? No. So more of a comment than a question, and it's that our company's made a $1 billion kind of commitment to have business lines kind of attack that racial wealth gap, and as part of someone who does volunteers and employee engagement, we're being hit with a lot of questions with how do we help, from colleagues, how do we get engaged? And so right now we're facing a gap where we know that we do a lot of activities that are targeted and align with our company's new focus area and strategic initiatives. But now we're scrambling to say, how do we harness all of that energy that is out there and funnel it into programming, which we haven't created yet or developed, but we know exists. We just have to kind of farm it out and, have conversations with our affinity networks and have conversations with our large sites that are actually, doing tremendous amounts of engagement to kind of mine the activities that we can actually point and direct our colleagues to. And so it's a little bit of a scramble when your company makes an announcement like that, and then we're like, oh, now we got to find something for everybody to do. And that's a challenge. We know that the activities are there. We just need to figure out how to actually connect our colleagues to them now.
Yeah, no, that's a big thing, right? So it's like these announcements, and then, all right, we'll figure it out on the back end, right? Kind of thing. And again, leaning on, different community partners, right? To ask, right? Go to the sources and say, hey, what is going to be of value? What's going to be meaningful to you, right? What types of skills, what types of things, are going to move the needle in terms of the city's commitment on solving for the racial wealth gap, right? So this is a part of it, but definitely it's, there's such energy around this, right? For the first time in a very long time, right? And some of that is also this kind of grace and accountability thing, right? So the grace is like, there's energy, people are excited about it, they want to do it, right? And that accountability thing of like, you have to do it, but also a part of that grace is, all right, let's take some time to make sure that we're doing it well. Right. And also some of the learning is in the doing. It's not going to be perfect. There is no perfect, right? And so giving yourself that space to also, experiment, which is exciting, right? To be able to like experiment and innovate and co-create with community partners in a variety of ways. So yes, you have lots of work to do, you and your team. And Kwame, we will make you the last question here.
Perfect. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. So it deals with volunteering, and I think this is kind of important. Like having the stigmas around certain communities, communities just certain communities. Excuse me, like Black or Brown or LGBTQ, and how people are hesitant on volunteering in these neighborhoods. How can we break that like stigma and break that ideal of, like you were saying, like every person that has a brain is biased. So it's like, how can we try to break that, if that makes any type of sense?
It makes sense, and I'll answer it in two ways. This work is a journey. It's not, everyone's got work to do. We all have different work, right? Like everyone's got work to do, but based on our different, life experiences and our identities, we got different work, right? We got different lanes to be playing in. So that's the first thing. In terms of a company perspective, it really is about that baseline, right? What your values are, what your framework, what your posture is with respect to this work, and then creating the capacity building workshops, the meaningful engagement for people to build their knowledge and their acumen and their comfort level, right? And also to be able to have difficult conversations about challenging these things, because there are two things at play here. There's individuals, as we went through before, individuals make up institutions. Institutions aren't just a thing, right? There are people making decisions, but we want to make sure that your company has set its baseline so that everyone, all your team members are clear about the rules of the road in the company, and then they can choose whether or not its values align with them or not, right? And then there's an accountability piece in terms of like those codes of conduct. Here's how we behave, right? Like, here's the values of this place. Here's what we're not going to stand for. And also there are consequences for acting out of alignment with our values, right? And again, then people have a choice of whether or not your company's right for them. It's that simple, right? So you can't necessarily solve for someone, either being excited about or wanting to engage in these issues of DEIA, but you can create the standards, but also the necessary preconditions for them to serve on your team.
Okay. I just want to give you like a snap for that. No, I understand, and trying to work with props on this, and trying to make sure that people feel comfortable in understanding the communities that we work with don't look like them, and so it's not difficult, but it's a challenge, and like you said, it's playing chess, not checkers, right? It's a journey, and that we need to learn that everybody's different, but we need to understand that we are human at the end of the day.
And it really is that grace accountability thing. There's grace, people have different life experiences. People have and have not been exposed to types of people. Also, you know, all right, maybe they learn one thing from their home life or from their schools, and then they go out into a broader world and those things are challenged, and then they are on an individual journey, right? You know, so there's got to be grace there. But then again, there's that accountability piece about what your company, what your organization stands for, and what your team members are expected to do and behave in ways of being both internally with your teams, but then also with your stakeholders and your volunteer partners. So there's always that. So you want to honor that people are at different starting points, but get clear, right, in terms of what the expectations are.
No, absolutely, and I appreciate that.
And I've supported Sheila Jackson Lee's bill.
All
So
right.
with that, yes, thank you so much, Ebony, for presenting and for being here with us today. I think everybody got a lot out of this session. And yeah, we're really excited to see where folks go with this next, and you know, how this gets continued to implement the knowledge back into your companies. So thank you again. We'll send out information from the slides as well as the recording to everyone following this presentation. And I'll also include Ebony's email on there as well. If you're interested in reaching out, please feel free. I also put in the chat my email if folks here are interested in joining future CVC meetings. As I said, we usually have them about quarterly. So we have one coming up in the spring, hopefully at the end of March. And yeah, so I think that's all that we have, but thank you all for joining us today.
Yeah, you all are an awesome, fun group. So thank you all for these awesome questions and engagement. And
Appreciate
best of
you.
luck.
Great. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.